9-year-old Jake Thompson lived in the tiny town of Maple Creek, nestled in the dense forests and misty mountains of Oregon. With a population of fewer than 500 people, the town was a quiet place where simplicity reigned, and the sounds of nature often replaced the noise of modern life. For Jake, the countryside wasn't just home. It was his entire world. Jake was a wiry boy with messy brown hair that seemed immune to brushing and curious brown eyes that always seemed to be searching for something new to explore. Most days, he could be found wandering through the woods near his house, building forts out of branches or observing animals from his hidden perches. His love for the natural world set him apart from other kids his age, but he didn't mind. The Thompson house was modest, a small wooden structure painted moss green to blend into its surroundings. It stood at the edge of town, where the paved roads gave way to gravel paths and the forest seemed to beckon with its mysteries. Jake's mom, Emily, was the town's only schoolteacher, a practical woman who wore her hair in a no-nonsense bun that rarely came undone. His dad, Robert, was a quiet, sturdy man who worked as a mechanic in the local garage. Although they were often busy, they encouraged Jake's curiosity, even if they didn't always understand his endless need for adventure. One crisp autumn morning, as Emily prepared breakfast in the cozy kitchen with its windows overlooking the distant mountains, Jake burst through the front door, breathless and muddy. "Jake, how many times do I have to tell you to wipe your boots before coming inside?" Emily scolded, pointing to the trail of dirt leading from the door. "Sorry, Mom," Jake gasped, "but you had to see it. There was this huge eagle flying so low. I swear I could have touched it." Robert looked up from his newspaper at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Eagles are amazing, son, but remember, they're also predators. And don't go past the old oak tree on the East Trail, okay?" "I know, Dad," Jake replied with a mischievous grin that betrayed his intentions. Maple Creek was a town steeped in unspoken rules and whispered stories. The forest that surrounded it was breathtakingly beautiful, but also shrouded in mystery. Locals shared tales of forgotten trails, dangerous wildlife, and even strangers who appeared where they shouldn't. Jake, however, saw the woods as his personal playground. He was fearless. Jake's favorite spot was Fig Tree Hill, a small rise covered with ancient trees whose roots twisted out of the ground like giant fingers. From there, he could see the entire town and the endless horizon of mountains. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape and let his imagination run wild. That morning, after finishing his breakfast, a quick slice of bread with jam, Jake grabbed his worn-out blue backpack. It was always packed with his essentials: a flashlight, a small pocket knife his grandpa had given him, and a notebook filled with sketches of animals and plants he encountered. "Jake, back before lunch," Emily called as he headed for the door. "I will, I promise," he yelled back, already running down the gravel path that led to the forest. The trail beneath his feet was soft with fallen leaves, and the crisp scent of pine filled the air. Jake knew these woods like the back of his hand, yet each time he ventured out, it felt like a new adventure. He moved quickly, his excitement growing with every step. That morning felt special, though Jake couldn't explain why. Something about the way the wind rustled through the trees made him feel like the forest was calling him deeper, as if it had something extraordinary to show him. Little did he know, this would be a day that would change his life forever. Jake's steps slowed as the sounds of the forest surrounded him. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the faint babbling of a stream in the distance. But suddenly, another sound reached his ears, cutting through the natural symphony. It was faint, barely audible at first, but it made Jake stop in his tracks. A whimper. His heart quickened. "What was that?" he whispered to himself, glancing around. The sound came again, more distinct this time. A low, pitiful whine that sent a shiver down his spine. Jake scanned the area, his eyes darting between the trees. It seemed to be coming from a thicket of bushes a few yards off the trail. Swallowing hard, he stepped cautiously toward the sound, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. Pushing aside the dense branches, Jake gasped. There, lying in the dirt, was a dog. A pitbull with a short, gray and white coat that was smeared with dirt and dried blood. One of its front paws was bent at an unnatural angle, and its body was thin, the ribs clearly visible beneath its skin. The dog's dark brown eyes met Jake's, wide with fear and pain. Jake knelt slowly, his movements deliberate. "Oh no, what happened to you?" he murmured. The dog let out another weak whine, baring its teeth slightly in a feeble attempt to defend itself. Jake froze, instinctively pulling back, his heart pounding. He had always loved animals, but the pit bull's size and condition made him nervous. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," Jake said softly, trying to sound as calm as possible. He stayed where he was, giving the dog space, but his eyes stayed locked on the injured animal. He noticed the way its chest rose and fell rapidly, as if every breath was a struggle. The dog was terrified, but Jake could also see something else: desperation. It was as if the animal knew it needed help but wasn't sure if it could trust him. Jake pulled off his old blue backpack and rummaged through it. "Let's see. What do I have here?" he muttered to himself. He pulled out an extra flannel shirt he'd packed and began tearing it into strips, his hands trembling slightly. He had no idea how to help a dog with a broken paw, but he couldn't just leave it there. "You're a tough one, huh?" Jake said, trying to sound reassuring as he worked. "I bet you've been through a lot." The dog's ears twitched slightly at the sound of Jake's voice. It still watched him warily, but didn't make another attempt to snap or growl. When he finished making a makeshift bandage, Jake inched closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm going to help you, okay? But I need you to trust me." The pit bull didn't move, its body tense but still. Jake took that as a good sign. Gently, he reached out and began wrapping the bandage around the injured paw. The dog whimpered softly but didn't pull away. Jake's heart ached at the sound. "Hang in there, buddy," Jake whispered. "You're going to be okay. I'll get you out of here." When the bandage was secure, Jake sat back on his heels and studied the dog. It still looked exhausted and wary, but there was a flicker of something in its eyes. Hope, maybe. Jake knew he couldn't leave the dog there, but carrying it back to his house wouldn't be easy. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenge ahead. "All right, big guy. Let's get you home," Jake said, his voice firm. He carefully slipped off his jacket and draped it over the dog, hoping to provide some comfort. Then he adjusted his backpack and prepared to lift the animal. The dog let out a low, reluctant growl as Jake slid his arms under it, but it didn't resist. It was heavier than he expected, and he stumbled slightly as he stood. "You're heavier than you look," Jake muttered, a small grin breaking through his worried expression. "But I've got you." As he began the long trek back to his house, Jake couldn't help but wonder about the dog's story. How had it ended up alone and injured in the woods? Who had abandoned it? Or worse, whatever had happened, Jake knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this dog down. The journey back home was far from easy. Jake trudged along the forest trail, his arms straining under the weight of the injured pit bull. Every few steps, the dog, who Jake had already decided to call Max, let out a soft whimper of pain, and Jake would stop to readjust his grip, murmuring words of reassurance. "It's okay, Max," Jake said, as if the name had always belonged to the dog. "We're almost there. You're gonna be safe now." But the truth was, Jake wasn't sure how far he could go. The dog was heavier than it looked, and the uneven terrain of the forest made each step feel like a challenge. The cool autumn air bit at his face, and he could feel sweat dripping down his back despite the chill. His legs burned, but he refused to stop. He couldn't leave Max behind. Halfway down the trail, Jake paused to catch his breath. Gently lowering Max to the ground, he crouched beside him. The dog's breathing was labored, and his body trembled slightly. Jake reached out a hand, hesitating for a moment before stroking Max's head. To his surprise, the dog didn't pull away. "You're a fighter, huh?" Jake said, his voice soft. "Just hang on a little longer. We'll get through this together." Max's eyes met Jake's, and for a brief moment, the fear and pain seemed to fade. Jake felt a surge of determination. He stood up, adjusted his backpack, and carefully lifted Max again. As Jake emerged from the forest and neared the edge of his neighborhood, he could feel the stares of the few people who were outside. Maple Creek was a small town, and anything out of the ordinary quickly drew attention. A pair of elderly neighbors watering their gardens stopped what they were doing to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Jake, what on earth are you doing?" called out Mrs. Hargrove, a woman known for her sharp tongue and keen interest in everyone else's business. Jake didn't stop. "I found him in the woods, Mrs. Hargrove. He's hurt. I'm taking him home." "Hurt or not, that's a pit bull," she said, her tone skeptical. "Those dogs can be dangerous, you know." Jake ignored her and kept walking. He wasn't in the mood to argue, and he was too tired to explain. All that mattered was getting Max to safety. When Jake finally reached his house, his arms were shaking from the effort. He set Max down gently on the front porch and leaned against the doorframe, catching his breath. The dog looked up at him with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. Taking a deep breath, Jake opened the door and called out, "Mom, Dad, I need your help." Emily was the first to appear, her hands still damp from doing the dishes. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of the dog on the porch. "Jake, what is that?" "It's a dog, Mom. I found him in the woods. He's hurt really bad," Jake explained quickly. "We have to help him." Robert appeared next, his expression unreadable as he stepped outside to get a closer look. He crouched down, examining Max's injuries with a practiced eye. "His paw's broken, and he's malnourished," he said grimly. "This dog's been through a lot. We can take care of him, right?" Jake asked, his voice pleading. "Just until he's better." Emily hesitated, her arms crossed. "Jake, this is a pit bull. We don't know where he came from, or if he's even safe to have around. What if he hurts you? Or someone else?" "He won't," Jake insisted. "He's scared and hurt, but he's not mean. Please, Mom, I couldn't just leave him there." Robert looked at his wife, then at the dog, whose eyes were half closed, clearly too weak to move. "Emily," he said quietly, "he's in bad shape. If we don't do something, he might not make it." Emily sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Fine, but just until he's well enough to go to a shelter. And Jake, you're responsible for him. Understand?" Jake nodded eagerly. "I promise." "Thank you, Mom." Turning to Max, Jake smiled and said, "Hear that, buddy? You're safe now." Max let out a soft, low groan, as if he understood. Jake felt a swell of pride and relief. He had made the right decision, and now he had a chance to prove it to everyone. Even Max's limp body leaned heavily against Jake as they crossed the threshold into the house. Jake was exhausted, but he pushed through, driven by a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt before. Emily grabbed an old blanket from the closet and spread it out on the living room floor. "Lay him here," she instructed, her voice firm but softened by concern. Jake gently lowered Max onto the blanket, careful not to jostle his injured paw. Max let out a low whimper but didn't resist. Emily knelt down, examining the dog's condition closely. She glanced at Robert, who stood nearby, his arms crossed and brow furrowed. "He's in rough shape," Emily said. "We're going to need to clean that wound and splint the paw, at least temporarily. Do you think he'll be okay?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated. "We'll do what we can." Robert disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a bowl of water and an old towel. "Let's start by cleaning him up. Jake, you stay back for now. He's scared, and we don't know how he'll react." Jake sat on the edge of the couch, watching as his parents worked on Max. Emily carefully cleaned the dried blood from his fur, while Robert stabilized the paw with a splint made from wooden skewers and medical tape. Max flinched a few times, but remained mostly still, his dark eyes following Jake. "Good boy, Max," Jake said softly. "You're doing great." At the sound of his name, Max's ears twitched slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Jake smile. After nearly an hour, Emily and Robert stepped back to assess their work. The paw was bandaged, and Max looked cleaner, though still painfully thin. Emily sighed, wiping her hands on the towel. "He needs food and rest," she said. "Jake, go grab the spare dog bowl from the garage. We'll give him some leftovers for now." Jake bolted up and returned moments later with the dusty bowl. He watched eagerly as Emily filled it with leftover chicken and rice. When she placed it in front of Max, the dog hesitated, sniffing cautiously before taking a tentative bite. Once he started, he didn't stop until the bowl was empty. "Poor guy must have been starving," Robert said, his tone softer than usual. Jake grinned. "See? He's not dangerous. He's just scared and hungry." Emily exchanged a glance with Robert, but said nothing. Jake could tell they were still unsure, but for now, Max was safe, and that was all that mattered. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Jake couldn't stop glancing at Max, who lay curled up on the blanket, his eyes half closed. The house felt quieter than usual, as if everyone was tiptoeing around the presence of their unexpected guest. So, Emily began, breaking the silence. "What's the plan for Max?" Jake looked up from his plate. "We keep him. He's my responsibility. I'll take care of him." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Jake, having a dog, especially one in his condition, is a lot of work. He's not a puppy you can just play with." "I know," Jake said, his voice firm, "but he needs me. I found him. He trusts me." Robert leaned back in his chair, studying his son. "It's not just about feeding him, Jake. He'll need regular care, vet visits, training. And there's the question of what happens when he's better. What if someone comes looking for him?" Jake hadn't thought about that. The idea of Max belonging to someone else sent a pang through his chest, but he didn't want to show his uncertainty. "I'll figure it out," he said finally. "Can we at least keep him until he's better?" Emily sighed. "We'll see how it goes. But if we decide it's too much, we'll have to take him to a shelter. Deal?" Jake nodded reluctantly. "Deal." That night, Jake set up a makeshift bed for himself on the floor near Max. As he lay there, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, he couldn't help but feel a connection to the dog. Max had been alone, hurt, and scared, but he had survived. In a way, Jake admired him. "You're gonna be okay, Max," Jake whispered, reaching out to lightly touch the dog's head. Max's eyes fluttered open for a moment before he let out a soft sigh and drifted back to sleep. Jake smiled to himself. For the first time in his young life, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. The next morning, Jake awoke to the sound of Max shifting on his blanket. For a moment, Jake feared that the dog might have gotten worse overnight. But when he sat up, he saw Max watching him with tired but alert eyes. A small flicker of hope warmed Jake's chest. "Morning, buddy," Jake said softly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He reached out cautiously, and this time, Max didn't flinch when Jake's hand brushed his head. Instead, the dog let out a low sigh and rested his chin on the blanket. Jake grinned. "See? You're already getting better." But when he turned toward the kitchen, he noticed his mom and dad standing near the counter, speaking in hushed tones. Their expressions were a mix of concern and uncertainty. Emily glanced at Jake and lowered her voice. "He's a sweet boy, but this dog, I just don't know if it's safe to keep him." Robert nodded, scratching his chin. "Pitbulls have a bad reputation, and if word gets out that we're keeping one, the neighbors won't take it lightly." Jake felt his stomach twist. He got up and walked into the kitchen, determined to make his case. "Max isn't dangerous," he said firmly. "He's hurt and scared, but he's not mean. He trusts me." "I know he does," Emily sighed, folding her arms across her chest. "Jake, we're not saying he's bad, but he's a big responsibility. And not everyone in town will see him the way you do." Robert chimed in. "Your mom's right. Maple Creek isn't exactly open-minded when it comes to things they don't understand. If the wrong person finds out we have a pit bull, it could cause trouble." Jake clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. "That's not fair. Max didn't do anything wrong. Why should we care what other people think?" Emily crouched down so she was at eye level with Jake. Her tone softened. "Sweetheart, it's not about what's fair. It's about being realistic. Taking care of Max is going to be hard, and we need to think about what's best for everyone, including him." Jake's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away. "I can do it. I'll take care of him. I'll feed him, walk him, whatever he needs. Just give me a chance." Robert exchanged a look with Emily. After a long pause, he said, "All right, Jake. We'll give this a trial run. But if anything happens, or if we can't manage it, we'll have to take him to a shelter." "Agreed?" Jake nodded quickly, relief flooding over him. Agreed. Thank you. Adjusting to life with Max over the next few days, Jake poured his heart into taking care of Max. He made sure the dog's water bowl was always full and fed him small portions throughout the day to help him regain his strength. Every morning and evening, Jake would sit by Max's side, talking to him in a soothing voice. "You're looking better already," Jake said one evening as he carefully adjusted Max's bandages. "Pretty soon, you'll be running around like nothing ever happened." Max wagged his tail faintly, the first sign of happiness Jake had seen since he'd found the dog. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Despite Jake's efforts, the tension in the house was palpable. Emily remained cautious, often glancing at Max from a distance, while Robert kept his concerns mostly to himself. The neighbors, however, were not so discreet. The neighbors start to notice one afternoon. Jake was sitting on the porch with Max when Mrs. Hargrove, the nosy woman from next door, walked by with her small terrier. She stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as she noticed Max lying on the porch. "Jake Thompson, is that a pitbull?" she asked, her tone dripping with disapproval. Jake straightened his back, his protective instincts kicking in. "His name is Max. He's not dangerous, Mrs. Hargrove. He's just hurt." Mrs. Hargrove pursed her lips. "You should be careful, young man. Dogs like that are trouble. I'd hate for something to happen to you, or anyone else." Jake's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay polite. "Max wouldn't hurt anyone. He's a good dog." Mrs. Hargrove sniffed and muttered something under her breath before walking away. Jake watched her go, his chest tight with frustration. He knew that convincing his parents was one thing, but winning over the town would be a much harder battle. A growing bond that evening, as Jake sat on the floor beside Max, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease left by Mrs. Hargrove's comments. He stroked Max's head gently, trying to push the worries out of his mind. "Don't listen to her, Max," he said quietly. "She doesn't know you like I do. You're not trouble. You're my friend." Max let out a soft, contented huff and nudged Jake's hand with his nose. Jake smiled, his resolve hardening. No matter what the neighbors thought, he was determined to prove them wrong. As the days turned into weeks, Max's condition steadily improved. His wounds began to heal, his coat regained its luster, and his once cautious demeanor gave way to a gentle and protective nature. Jake spent every moment he could by Max's side, feeding him, tending to his bandages, and talking to him like an old friend. "Look at you, Max," Jake said one afternoon as they sat in the backyard. Max was lying in the grass, his injured paw stretched out in front of him. "You're getting stronger every day. Soon, you'll be running circles around me." Max wagged his tail lazily and rested his head on Jake's lap. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Jake. For the first time, he felt like he had earned the dog's trust. Emily watched from the kitchen window, her arms folded across her chest. She still had reservations about keeping Max, but she couldn't deny the change she saw in both the dog and her son. Jake had always been curious and independent, but since finding Max, he seemed more focused, more determined. "He's really taken to that dog," Emily said, turning to Robert, who was sitting at the kitchen table. "I've never seen him this committed to anything before." Robert nodded, sipping his coffee. "It's good for him. Teaches responsibility. But you know the town's not going to let this slide. People are already talking." Emily sighed. "I know. Mrs. Hargrove's already asked me twice what we're planning to do with Max. I don't want trouble, but I don't want to break Jake's heart either." Robert set his mug down and leaned back in his chair. "Let's see how it plays out. Maybe the dog will prove them all wrong." Max's loyalty shines one evening, as Jake and Max were playing in the yard. A loud crack of thunder rumbled through the air. The sky darkened, and rain began to fall in heavy drops. Jake ran to the porch, laughing as the rain soaked his hair. "Come on, Max," he called. Max hesitated for a moment, his ears flicking nervously, before bounding up the steps to join Jake. The two of them sat together, watching the storm roll in. Jake wrapped an arm around Max, feeling the warmth of the dog's body against his side. "I don't care what anyone says," Jake murmured. "You're part of the family now." As if in response, Max licked Jake's hand, his tail wagging faintly. It was a quiet moment, but it solidified their bond in Jake's mind. The turning point the next morning, Jake decided to take Max for a short walk around the neighborhood. He wanted to show everyone that Max wasn't the dangerous animal they imagined. He clipped an old leash to Max's collar, a hand-me-down from a dog they'd had years ago, and set off down the gravel road. At first, things went smoothly. Max walked calmly by Jake's side, his tail wagging slightly. A few neighbors glanced their way but didn't say anything. Jake felt a spark of hope. But as they rounded a corner, they encountered Mr. Langley, a gruff older man known for his short temper. He was walking his German shepherd, who immediately began barking at Max. "Keep that beast away from me," Mr. Langley shouted, his face red with anger. Jake tightened his grip on the leash. "Max isn't a beast. He's friendly. He won't hurt anyone," Mr. Langley scoffed. "That's what they all say, until it's too late. Dogs like that don't belong here." Max stood still, his ears back but his posture calm. He didn't bark or growl, even as the German shepherd strained against its leash. Jake knelt beside Max, placing a hand on his head. "He's not like that," Jake said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "He's a good dog." Mr. Langley muttered something under his breath and walked away, dragging his still barking dog behind him. Jake let out a shaky breath and looked down at Max. "You didn't even flinch," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "You're amazing." A shift in perspective word of the encounter with Mr. Langley spread quickly through the town, but something surprising happened. Instead of more criticism, a few people began to soften their stance on Max. "That boy's got guts," one neighbor told Emily at the grocery store. "Standing up for that dog like that. Maybe he's onto something." Emily relayed the comment to Robert that evening. "It's a start," she said with a small smile. Robert nodded. "Max is earning his place here, little by little." Jake overheard the conversation and felt a swell of determination. He knew they still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like people might actually give Max a chance. Jake's hopes for Max's acceptance in Maple Creek were growing, but not everyone in the small town was ready to embrace the idea of a pitbull living among them. As word spread about Max, whispers turned into outright concern, and concern turned into action. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Jake was sitting on the front porch with Max when his parents called him inside. Jake's heart sank when he saw the serious expressions on their faces. Robert stood near the window, peering out at the gravel road, while Emily sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in her hands. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with worry. Emily sighed, motioning for him to sit. "We need to talk, Jake." Jake sat down, his eyes darting between his parents. "Is it about Max?" Emily nodded and handed him the paper. It was a petition, signed by several of the town's residents, asking for Max to be removed from the neighborhood. "They think he's dangerous," Emily said, her voice soft but firm. "Some people are worried about their safety, Jake. They don't want him here." Jake felt a surge of anger. "But he hasn't done anything wrong. Max is the sweetest dog I've ever met. How can they think he's dangerous?" Robert turned away from the window and walked over to the table. "People are scared of what they don't understand," he said. "And Max being a pit bull, well, that's enough for some folks." Jake clenched his fists, his face turning red. "That's not fair. They don't even know him. If they just gave him a chance." Emily reached out, placing a hand on Jake's arm. "We know that, Jake, and we're on your side. But you have to understand, we can't force people to change their minds overnight." Jake looked down at the petition, the signatures blurring through his tears. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to fight this," Robert said firmly. "But we'll do it the right way. No yelling, no arguing. We'll show them that Max is part of this family and this community." Jake nodded, wiping his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes." A town meeting word of the petition prompted the town to organize a meeting at the local community center. Jake, determined to defend Max, insisted on attending. He spent hours preparing what he wanted to say, scribbling notes in his notebook and practicing in front of the mirror. The meeting was packed. Dozens of residents filled the small room, their voices a low hum of chatter until the town's mayor, Mrs. Green, called for order. "We're here to discuss concerns about the Thompson family's dog," she began, her tone neutral. I understand there's been a lot of debate about this, and we want to address everyone's concerns fairly. Jake felt his stomach twist as a few residents began speaking. Most of them echoed the same sentiment. Max was a pit bull, and pit bulls were dangerous. Mrs. Hargrove stood up, clutching her purse tightly. I've lived in this town for 30 years, and I've never seen a dog like that here. We don't need that kind of trouble. Jake's hand shot up before he could lose his nerve. Mrs. Green nodded toward him, and he stood, clutching his notebook. Max isn't trouble, Jake began, his voice shaky but determined. He's my friend. When I found him, he was hurt and scared. He didn't growl or snap. He just needed help. And since then, he's never once shown aggression to anyone. Some murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Jake pressed on. I know pit bulls have a bad reputation, but Max isn't like that. He's loyal, kind, and brave. He saved me when no one else was there for him. And I know if you gave him a chance, you'd see that too. Jake's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then Mr. Langley stood up. He might be a good dog, he said gruffly, but what happens if he snaps one day? Who's responsible then? Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Robert cut in, his voice calm and authoritative. That's a risk with any dog, Mr. Langley. Breed doesn't determine behavior. How they're treated does. And Max has only known kindness since he came into our home. The turning point as the meeting continued, Jake and his parents answered question after question, countering fear with facts and sharing Max's story. Some people remained unconvinced, but others began to soften. Toward the end of the meeting, an elderly man named Mr. Carter stood up. He had lived in Maple Creek longer than anyone and rarely spoke at public events. When I was a boy, he said, his voice gravelly, my family took in a stray mutt that everyone in town said was dangerous. Turned out to be the best dog we ever had. Saved my little sister from a snake once. He looked directly at Jake. Sometimes it's not about what people think. It's about what you know in your heart. Jake smiled, hope rekindled. The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but Jake could feel the shift in the room. People were beginning to see Max through his eyes. A new resolve that night. As Jake sat beside Max on the porch, he felt a renewed determination. We'll show them, he said softly, stroking Max's head. We'll show them all what kind of dog you really are. Max licked Jake's hand, his tail thumping softly against the porch floor. Together, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The tension in Maple Creek had been building for weeks. Despite Jake's heartfelt defense of Max at the town meeting, some residents remained firm in their opposition. Whispers of discontent grew louder, and Jake could sense the unease every time he and Max walked through town. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. The warning: it was a crisp fall afternoon when Jake overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. He was walking past the general store when he heard Mrs. Hargrove and Mr. Langley talking in hushed but heated tones. I've had enough of that dog, Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice sharp. If the Thompsons won't get rid of him, we'll have to take matters into our own hands. You're right, Mr. Langley agreed. It's only a matter of time before that dog hurts someone. Jake's heart pounded as he ducked behind a nearby stack of crates, listening intently. They didn't mention specifics, but it was clear they were planning something. Without wasting another second, Jake bolted home, his mind racing. Warning his parents, Jake burst through the door, startling Emily, who was folding laundry in the living room. Mom, we have a problem, he exclaimed, breathless. Emily dropped the shirt in her hands. Jake, what's wrong? Jake quickly explained what he had overheard. Emily's face grew pale, and she immediately called Robert into the room. Together, they discussed what to do. Maybe we should lay low for a while, Emily suggested, her voice tinged with worry. Keep Max inside and out of sight. No, Jake said firmly. Hiding won't solve anything. We need to show them they're wrong about Mac. Robert nodded slowly. Jake's right. Running from this won't change their minds. But we do need to be careful. The attempt later that evening, Jake decided to take Max for a quick walk to the edge of the woods, a place where he often went to clear his head. As they walked, Max seemed unusually alert, his ears perked up and his nose twitching. Jake assumed it was just the sounds of the forest until Max stopped abruptly, letting out a low growl. "What is it, Max?" Jake whispered, his own nerves kicking in. From the shadows of the trees, Jake saw movement. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but then he heard voices. "Over there," someone hissed. It was Mr. Langley's voice. Jake's heart leapt into his throat as he realized what was happening. A group of neighbors had followed him and Max, likely planning to confront them. Or worse, take Max away. Jake tightened his grip on Max's leash and took a step back. "Stay calm, Max," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. The group emerged from the trees, flashlights in hand. There were 3 of them: Mr. Langley, Mrs. Hargrove, and another man Jake didn't recognize. Their expressions were a mix of fear and determination. "That dog doesn't belong here," Mr. Langley said, his voice cold. "We're not going to let you or your family put the rest of us in danger." Jake stood his ground, his legs trembling but his resolve unshaken. "Max isn't dangerous. He's never hurt anyone." "That's what they all say," Mrs. Hargrove snapped. "We're just trying to protect the town." "You don't know him," Jake shot back, his voice rising. "You're scared because he's a pitbull, but that doesn't make him a bad dog." Max, sensing the tension, stood protectively in front of Jake. He didn't bark or growl, but his posture made it clear that he was ready to defend his boy if necessary. A test of courage before anyone could say another word. A rustling sound came from the underbrush. A split second later, a coyote darted out of the woods, snarling and baring its teeth. Jake froze in terror as the wild animal lunged toward them. Max reacted instantly. Despite his still-healing paw, he leapt forward, placing himself between Jake and the coyote. A fierce growl erupted from Max's throat as he squared off with the predator. The coyote hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. "Max, no," Jake cried, but it was too late to stop him. The coyote lunged again, and Max met it head-on. The 2 animals clashed, their snarls echoing through the forest. Jake watched in horror as Max fought with every ounce of strength he had. Despite his injury, Max managed to drive the coyote back, forcing it to retreat into the woods with a defeated yelp. As the forest fell silent, Max limped back to Jake, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. Jake dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Max's neck. "You saved me," Jake whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You're the bravest dog I've ever known." The group of neighbors stood in stunned silence, their flashlights illuminating the scene. For the first time, they seemed to see Max for what he truly was, not a threat, but a protector. The aftermath, Mrs. Hargrove was the first to speak, her voice uncharacteristically soft. I didn't think a dog like him could do something like that." Mr. Langley cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Maybe we were wrong about him." Jake looked up, his arms still around Max. "You were wrong. Max isn't a monster. He's a hero." The group exchanged uneasy glances before quietly dispersing, leaving Jake and Max alone. Jake's heart was still pounding, but for the first time, he felt like the tide was turning. A hero's welcome. When Jake and Max returned home, Jake recounted the entire event to his parents. Emily hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes, while Robert knelt down to examine Max's injuries. "He's incredible," Robert said, shaking his head in amazement. "That dog just saved your life." Jake nodded, stroking Max's head gently. "He's not just a dog. He's my best friend." That night, as Max lay sleeping at Jake's feet, Jake couldn't help but feel proud. Max had proved himself to the town and to Jake when it mattered most. Together, they had faced the odds and come out stronger for it. The events in the forest spread through Maple Creek like wildfire. Word of how Max had defended Jake against the coyote traveled from house to house, shifting the narrative that had once painted him as a danger into one of quiet heroism. But not everyone was convinced, and for Jake, the battle for Max's acceptance was far from over. The town reacts. The next morning, Jake and his family sat at the breakfast table, the atmosphere heavier than usual. Max lay at Jake's feet, his head resting on his paws, his body showing signs of the battle from the night before. His bandages were freshly replaced, and though his paw still needed time to heal, his spirit remained undiminished. Emily handed Robert a cup of coffee. The phone's been ringing all morning. Everyone's talking about what happened. Good or bad? Jake asked, nervously pushing his eggs around on his plate. A little of both, Emily admitted. Some people are impressed by Max. Others, well, they still think he's dangerous. Jake sighed, slumping in his chair. What else does he have to do to prove himself? Before anyone could respond, there was a knock at the door. Jake sprang to his feet, already guessing who it might be. He opened the door to find Mr. Carter, the elderly man who had spoken in Max's defense during the town meeting. "Good morning, young man," Mr. Carter said, tipping his hat. His gaze shifted to Max, who had risen to stand beside Jake. "I came to see the hero of the hour." Jake grinned, stepping aside to let Mr. Carter in. "Max is right here." Mr. Carter knelt down, his movements slow but deliberate, and extended a hand toward Max. The dog sniffed his hand before gently nudging it with his nose. "He's a fine animal," Mr. Carter said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "You've got yourself a real friend here, Jake. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." A growing acceptance as the days went on. More people began to soften toward Max. A few neighbors stopped by to check on Jake, curious to see the dog who had become the talk of the town. Max greeted each visitor with a wag of his tail and a calm demeanor that left many surprised. Even Mrs. Hargrove, who had been one of Max's most vocal critics, seemed to be reconsidering her stance. One afternoon, she stopped by while walking her terrier, a feisty little dog named Baxter. Jake saw her approaching and braced himself for another confrontation. But to his surprise, Mrs. Hargrove smiled, albeit awkwardly. "I heard about what happened," she said, her eyes darting to Max by suppose. "I might have misjudged him." Jake beamed. "He's not what people think, Mrs. Hargrove. He's a good dog. The best." She hesitated before nodding. "Maybe he is." Jake and Max faced new challenges despite the growing support. Not everyone was ready to let go of their fears. At a town council meeting later that week, the debate about Max's place in the community flared up again. "He may have done a good thing," Mr. Langley argued, his tone still laced with skepticism. "But that doesn't change the fact that he's a pitbull. One incident doesn't erase the risks." Jake stood up, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. "It's not about what he is. It's about who he is. Max isn't dangerous. He's brave, loyal, and kind. If you give him a chance, he'll prove it to all of you." The room fell silent. Mrs. Green, the mayor, finally spoke up. "It seems to me that Max has already proven himself to some extent. Perhaps it's time we judge him by his actions, not his breed." Her words sparked a ripple of agreement among the crowd. But Jake knew it would take more than a few kind words to win over everyone. A symbol of courage over the following weeks, Max's reputation continued to grow. Jake took him on more walks around town, stopping to chat with neighbors who had once avoided them. Max's calm demeanor and gentle nature began to win people over, one interaction at a time. The true turning point came when Mr. Carter proposed an idea to the town council, a community event celebrating the courage and loyalty of animals. The council approved, and the event was scheduled for the following month. Max was named the guest of honor. The event brought the entire town together. People who had once been wary of Max now approached him with smiles and outstretched hands. Kids petted his head, and parents asked Jake about Max's story. Even Mr. Langley offered a reluctant nod of approval. As Jake stood beside Max, looking out at the crowd, he felt a surge of pride. Max had gone from an outcast to a symbol of what the town could become. More compassionate, more understanding, and less ruled by fear. A new beginning that night. As the Thompsons sat on the porch watching the stars, Jake leaned down to hug Max. "You did it, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed their minds." Max licked Jake's face, his tail wagging lazily. Emily and Robert exchanged a proud glance, knowing how much their son had grown through the journey. Max had not only found a home, he had also found a place in the hearts of the people who once doubted him. And for Jake, that was the greatest victory of all. The morning after the community event, the air in Maple Creek felt different. The tension that had lingered for weeks seemed to have lifted, replaced by a cautious but palpable sense of unity. For Jake, it felt like the beginning of something new, not just for Max, but for the entire town. The day after, Jake woke up to find Max lying at the foot of his bed, snoring softly. The dog had become a fixture in his life, and it was hard to believe that just weeks ago, Max had been a scared, injured animal in the woods. "Time to get up, buddy," Jake said, scratching Max behind the ears. Max let out a contented groan before stretching and hopping off the bed. As Jake headed to the kitchen, he was greeted by the smell of pancakes. Emily stood by the stove, flipping another batch, while Robert sat at the table reading the local newspaper. "Morning, champ," Robert said, glancing up from the paper. "Your dog made the front page." Jake's eyes widened as Robert handed him the paper. The headline read, "Max the Pitbull, from Outcast to Hero," accompanied by a photo of Jake and Max from the community event. Jake's heart swelled with pride. "Looks like Max is officially a celebrity," Emily said with a smile as she set a plate of pancakes in front of Jake. Jake grinned. He deserves it. Unexpected visitors later that day. As Jake and Max played fetch in the backyard, a car pulled up in front of the house. Jake recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Mrs. Hargrove. She stepped out hesitantly, holding a small basket in her hands. "Hi, Mrs. Hargrove," Jake said, walking toward her with Max at his side. "Hello, Jake," she replied, her voice unusually soft. Her eyes flicked to Max, who sat calmly by Jake's side. "I wanted to bring this by as a peace offering." She handed Jake the basket, which was filled with homemade cookies and a few dog treats. Jake stared at it in surprise before breaking into a smile. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Max appreciates it." Mrs. Hargrove chuckled nervously. "Well, I suppose I owe you both an apology. I was wrong about him. He's quite the dog." Jake beamed. "He is. Thanks for giving him a chance." Max wagged his tail and nudged Mrs. Hargrove's hand with his nose. She let out a surprised laugh and reached down to pet him. A new chapter over the following weeks, Max continued to settle into his new life. His strength returned, and his injured paw healed completely. He became a familiar presence around Maple Creek, accompanying Jake on errands and even helping Robert in the garage, where he'd lie in the sun and watch the customers come and go. The neighbors who once feared Max now greeted him warmly. Kids from the school often stopped by to visit, bringing treats and playing with him in the yard. Max had become a beloved part of the community, a living reminder of the power of kindness and second chances. Jake's reflection one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jake sat on the porch steps with Max at his side. The golden light bathed the town in a warm glow, and the air was filled with the distant sounds of laughter and conversation. "You know, Max," Jake said, his voice thoughtful, "I think you changed more than just me. You changed this whole town." Max looked up at Jake, his dark eyes full of understanding, and rested his head on Jake's knee. Jake smiled, running his fingers through Max's soft fur. "Life's better with you here," Jake continued. "I'm so glad I found you." The legacy of Max's story became a turning point for Maple Creek. It wasn't just about a dog. It was about overcoming fear, embracing compassion, and finding strength in unlikely places. Jake and Max had taught the town a valuable lesson: that everyone, no matter their past or appearance, deserves a chance to prove who they really are. For Jake, Max was more than just a pet. He was a friend, a protector, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest rewards come from the risks we take for others. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Jake leaned back and gazed upward, Max still resting at his side. He didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain. Whatever came next, he and Max would face it together. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and check out this next story. It's incredibly moving.